The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. I am Vec Thala Orn, a liaison officer of the Severnax Concord, and I was standing on the observation deck of Outpost Rydellum when the numbers on my display turned red and refused to turn back. A single vessel had entered our monitored space. Not a fleet, not a formation, one ship, and every sensor operator on that deck went silent at the same moment, as if the air itself had been pulled out of the room. I remember gripping the edge of the console because my legs did not feel steady. Around me, junior officers were trying to pull up identification records, but the ship matched nothing in our archives. It was not that the ship was unknown in the sense of being new. It was that the ship refused to be measured. Its hull absorbed our scanning pulses instead of reflecting them. Its engine signature did not match any drive class we had cataloged, and it was moving toward us with a patience that felt worse than aggression. Aggression we understood. This was something else. I want to explain, before I go further, that I am not a soldier. I have spent my career writing reports, attending council sessions, and translating disputes between species who would rather not speak to each other directly. I tell you this so you understand that what I witnessed was not filtered through the eyes of someone trained for combat. It was filtered through the eyes of someone who believed, right up until that morning, that the galaxy was a predictable place, a place where power belonged to those who had held it the longest, and where new arrivals eventually learned to wait their turn. Humanity was supposed to be one of those new arrivals. I had read their file more times than I could count. Species designation, Terran. Homeworld, a single planet called Earth, tucked into an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. Technological maturity, developing. Threat classification, low, with a footnote suggesting long-term potential that nobody on the council took seriously enough to revisit. I remembered the exact wording of that footnote, because I had drafted an earlier version of it myself, years ago, before any of this began. We wrote it the way we wrote every entry for a new species, with a kind of polite indifference. The galaxy had seen 1,000 young civilizations rise, stumble, and eventually accept their place in the order of things. There was no reason to believe humans would be any different. I was wrong. Everyone I worked with was wrong. And on that morning, watching a single unmarked ship drift toward our border station without firing a single shot or issuing a single demand, I began to understand just how wrong we had been. The station commander, a broad-shouldered Vantic officer named Usep Kaldranar, ordered a hailing frequency opened. I stood beside him because protocol required a liaison present for any contact with a species under diplomatic review. He was calm in the way that senior officers learn to be calm, even when the numbers on the screen make no sense. Unidentified vessel. This is Outpost Rydellum, he said, his voice steady. You are entering restricted monitoring space. Please respond with identification and intent. There was no answer. Not silence exactly. The channel remained open. We could hear something on the other end, a low hum, almost like breathing, though I told myself that was impossible for a ship. It felt, absurdly, like being listened to rather than ignored. Usep repeated the hail. Again nothing. He tried a third time, and this time his voice carried the faintest edge of frustration, the kind that comes from a person used to being answered. I remember checking the coordinates the ship was broadcasting, because that was the only thing it did transmit. Not words, not a name, just a string of numbers that our navigation officer, a nervous young Corvani named Illa Bresk, translated within seconds, and then went pale reading aloud. Those are the coordinates of Junction 7, she said, the border checkpoint. I felt something cold settle into my chest, because I knew exactly what had happened at Junction 7 3 months earlier. Everyone in this sector knew. It was the kind of incident that gets buried in procedural language and quiet apologies, the kind that never makes it to a full council session, because nobody wants to admit fault. A Terran science vessel, unarmed, had been intercepted at that checkpoint over a licensing discrepancy that turned out, upon later review, to be an administrative error on our side. The vessel was held for 11 days, while officials argued over jurisdiction. Life support on the Terran ship was never designed for that kind of delay. 3 crew members died before the paperwork was resolved, and the ship was finally released with something between an apology and a shrug. I had read the incident report. I had even helped draft the response that was eventually sent to the Terran government, a carefully worded document expressing regret without admitting liability. offering a token compensation package that the Terran ambassador at the time had accepted without protest. I remember thinking, at the time, that the matter was closed. Humans, like every other young species we had processed, seemed to understand that friction, with an established power, was simply the cost of admission into galactic society. They did not retaliate. They did not even complain loudly. They simply went quiet. I did not understand then that their silence was not acceptance. It was preparation. USEP tried the hailing frequency one more time, and this time something changed. The low hum on the channel shifted, resolved itself into a voice. Not translated through any protocol I recognized, just a voice, calm, unhurried, speaking our language with a clarity that suggested the ship had studied us far more carefully than we had ever studied it. "This is not a negotiation," the voice said. "Nothing else. No demand, no threat, no explanation." The channel closed on its own a moment later, and the ship continued its approach exactly as it had before, unbothered, unhurried, as if the entire exchange had simply been a courtesy extended to a species it did not consider capable of responding meaningfully anyway. I looked at USEP. His expression had shifted from confusion into something closer to alarm, though he tried to hide it behind procedure. He ordered the station to full alert, recalled the 2 patrol cruisers stationed nearby, and requested immediate guidance from Sector Command. I remember the exact tone of his voice when he turned to me and asked what I knew about Terran diplomatic behavior, because in that moment, my job suddenly mattered more than it ever had before. I told him what I knew, which felt embarrassingly little. Humans had joined the wider galactic community only a few decades earlier, discovered by a Severnax survey vessel that had stumbled across one of their early transmissions. Contact had been cautious on both sides at first, though it quickly became clear that humans were eager to participate, eager to trade, eager to be accepted. That eagerness, I now realize, was mistaken by nearly everyone I worked with as weakness. A species desperate for approval, we assumed, would tolerate almost anything to keep that approval intact. We were not entirely wrong about the eagerness. We were catastrophically wrong about what it meant. Sector Command responded to USEP's request within minutes, which itself was unusual, since Sector Command rarely responded to anything within minutes. The message was brief. Do not engage. Maintain observation only. Escalate to Council oversight immediately. I remember the way USEP read that message twice before setting it down, because it was, in its own quiet bureaucratic way, an admission that something had gone very wrong very quickly. Sector Command did not issue do not engage orders for minor incidents. They issued them when the situation had already outgrown local authority. The Terran vessel reached Junction 7 4 hours later. I was still on the observation deck when the first sensor readings came through, relayed from the checkpoint's automated monitoring array before, one by one, those relays went silent. Not destroyed, just quiet, as though something had reached in and turned them off with the same unhurried precision the ship had shown in everything else it did. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not feel fear exactly. Fear implies a threat you can name. What I felt was closer to disorientation, the sense that the rules I had spent my entire career learning no longer applied. We had always assumed that power in the galaxy followed a simple hierarchy. Older species held authority over younger ones, not through cruelty exactly, but through the quiet assumption that seniority earned deference. Humans had been treated according to that hierarchy from the moment we discovered them. Every trade agreement favored established powers. Every dispute was resolved in favor of precedent, which almost always meant favoring whoever had been part of galactic society longer. Humans had accepted every one of those terms without meaningful objection. I understood, standing on that deck, that acceptance had never meant agreement. It had meant patience. The last transmission from Junction 7 came through garbled, barely readable, from a junior officer stationed there whose name I never learned and have thought about often since. It was not a distress call in the traditional sense. There was no panic in the voice, no screaming, nothing dramatic, just a single confused sentence, cut short. It is not attacking the station. It is reading something. It is looking for. The transmission ended there, not destroyed mid-sentence in the way you might imagine. It simply stopped, as though whoever was speaking had been interrupted by something they suddenly understood and did not have time to explain. "Illa!" The navigation officer was the one who eventually pieced together what that meant, though it took her the better part of the next hour, cross-referencing personnel logs against duty rosters from 3 months earlier. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet in a way that made everyone on the deck stop what they were doing to listen. "It is only removing certain individuals," she said. "Not the whole station. Just the officers who were on duty during the Junction 7 incident. The ones responsible for the delay." I remember the room going very still after she said that, because it meant the ship had not arrived with a general grievance against our species, or even against our station. It had arrived with a list. A specific, verified list of names, cross-referenced against exactly who had made which decision during those 11 days. And it was working through that list with the same unhurried precision it had shown in every previous action. Usep asked her how she could be certain, and she pulled up the station's own duty logs alongside the pattern of what was happening at Junction 7, showing that every officer who had been flagged as unreachable in the last hour corresponded exactly to someone named in the original incident report. Not a single name outside that list had been affected, not a single innocent bystander. It was, in its own terrifying way, precise beyond anything our own systems were capable of. I think that precision frightened me more than raw destruction would have. Destruction is chaotic. It can be blamed on accident, on excess, on the fog of conflict. This was neither. This was accountability, delivered with the same calm certainty as a court ruling, except there had been no trial, no hearing, no opportunity to explain or apologize. The verdict had already been reached somewhere far from here, and the ship had simply arrived to carry it out. Sector Command escalated the matter to full council review within the hour, which I later learned was the fastest escalation in the history of our administrative system. I was ordered to prepare a full report of everything I had witnessed, to be delivered in person at the next council session. I remember sitting alone in my quarters that night, unable to sleep, replaying the voice from the hailing channel over and over in my mind. This is not a negotiation. I had spent my entire career believing that every conflict, no matter how serious, eventually became a negotiation. That was the foundation of galactic diplomacy, the quiet assumption underneath every treaty and every council session. Someone always wanted something they were willing to discuss. Someone always had a price. I lay awake trying to understand what it meant for a species to arrive without wanting to discuss anything at all, and I could not shake the feeling that we had misunderstood humanity from the very first contact, mistaking their patience for the absence of a limit, rather than the presence of one we had simply never located. By morning, 3 more checkpoints along our border had gone silent in exactly the same fashion. Not destroyed, not overrun, simply quiet, their personnel logs later confirming the same pattern Illa had discovered the night before. Only those directly responsible for specific decisions, going back months, in some cases years, had been affected. Everyone else on those stations remained untouched, their reports later describing the same eerie experience of watching the ship arrive, watching it search, and watching it leave without a single word exchanged. I was summoned to the council chamber 2 days later, my report clutched in my hands, though I already knew that no report I could write would adequately explain what I had witnessed. How do you describe an experience for which your entire species has no framework? We had catalogued 1,000 forms of conflict across 1,000 species. We had never catalogued this. A single vessel, moving through our territory with the patience of something that had waited a very long time and intended to be thorough, now that it had finally decided to act. As I walked through the corridors toward the council chamber, I passed groups of officials speaking in hushed, urgent tones, all of them asking versions of the same question I could not answer. What did humanity want? What had changed? And underneath every question, though nobody said it aloud yet, was a fear I recognized because I felt it myself. If this was only the beginning, what exactly had we spent the last several decades teaching this species to expect from us? I did not know the answer yet. I only knew that whatever calm and reasonable version of humanity we had built in our reports and our assessments had never truly existed. What existed instead was something that had been watching, recording, and waiting, and had only now decided the waiting was over. The chamber doors opened, and every eye in that room turned toward me, expecting explanations I did not have. I stepped inside anyway, because it was my duty to speak, even though I understood, perhaps for the first time in my career, that the galaxy I thought I knew had already changed, and none of us had been given the chance to prepare for it. I did not know, standing there, that this was only the first quiet chapter of something far larger. I did not know that the single ship at our border was not an isolated response, but the opening move of a pattern that would soon spread across every system that had ever dealt carelessly with the people of Earth. I only knew, as the chamber fell silent waiting for my testimony, that whatever certainty I once had about the order of the galaxy had been replaced by something far more unsettling. The understanding that we had spent decades measuring a species by how quietly they endured mistreatment, and had never once considered what might happen the day they decided they no longer needed to endure it at all. I cleared my throat, opened my report, and began to speak, though even as the words left my mouth, I understood that no words I had could capture the sound of that voice on the hailing channel, calm and certain and utterly without anger, telling us plainly that whatever this was not something we would be allowed to talk our way out of. The council listened in silence, and somewhere far beyond our border, that single vessel continued its slow, patient work, moving from station to station, with a precision that made it clear this had never been about a single incident at all. It had been about every incident, quietly recorded, quietly remembered, across every year since first contact, and now, at last, quietly answered. I finished my testimony that day without a single question from the council floor, which had never happened in any session I had attended before. They simply sat there, processing what I had described, and I understood from their silence that they were beginning to feel the same disorientation I had felt on that observation deck. The comfortable order we had built our entire diplomatic system upon was no longer something we could rely on, and none of us yet understood how deep that change would run, or how many of our own decisions, made carelessly over the years, were about to come due. The council did not adjourn that day so much as it simply ran out of things to say, and I was dismissed with instructions to remain on standby for further testimony. I remember walking back through the corridors of the council building feeling as though I had aged several years in the span of a single meeting. What I did not know yet was that my standby status would last only a matter of hours, because the situation at our border was about to become something none of us had a name for. I was recalled to Outpost Rydellum 2 days later, not because anyone expected me to contribute anything useful in a military sense, but because the council had decided, in its usual fashion, that a liaison officer needed to be present wherever contact with the Terran vessel continued, in case dialogue ever became possible again. I did not believe dialogue was coming. Nobody who had heard that voice on the hailing channel believed it either. But protocol is a stubborn thing, and so I found myself back on that same observation deck, watching a display that had grown far more crowded since my last visit. The single vessel that had first appeared at our border was gone. In its place, sensor arrays across 4 adjoining systems had begun registering additional signatures, each one matching the same unidentifiable hull profile as the first. Not a fleet in the traditional sense. No formation, no visible coordination between them, nothing that resembled the kind of military buildup our own tacticians would have recognized. Just individual ships, scattered across separate systems, each one moving with the same unhurried, deliberate pace toward specific coordinates that our analysts had already begun to map against old incident reports. Usep briefed me the moment I stepped off the transport, his expression tighter than I remembered it being before. He had not slept properly in days, and it showed in the way his hands moved slightly faster than his words, pulling up star charts on the situation table between us. 7 ships now, he said. Possibly more we have not detected. Each one has arrived at a system where a Terran citizen or vessel was mistreated in the past. Not attacked outright, just present, doing exactly what the first one did, searching for individuals connected to specific decisions. I asked him how far back the pattern extended, and he gave me a number that made my stomach turn. Some of the incidents being addressed were nearly a decade old, small things, individually. A trade dispute where a Terran merchant vessel had been deliberately underpaid for a shipment of rare minerals, the difference in credits small enough that nobody had bothered to contest it at the time. A diplomatic aide who had been quietly dismissed from a negotiation session because a senior Vantic official found the presence of a human representative distasteful. A research team denied access to a shared archive out of nothing more than habit, the kind of casual exclusion that had become so normal across the galaxy that nobody thought to question it. None of these incidents, taken alone, would have been considered serious enough to warrant any kind of council attention. That was, I realized with growing unease, exactly the point. Humanity had not been keeping a record of catastrophes. They had been keeping a record of everything, no matter how small, and treating each entry with the same quiet seriousness we reserved only for our gravest violations. I remember asking Usep the question that had been building in me since my first night on that deck. Why now? If humans had been recording every slight for years, why had they waited until now to act on any of it? He did not have an answer, and neither did anyone else on the station, though a theory began to circulate among the analysts over the following days that I found difficult to dismiss. Humanity, according to several long-range signal intercepts our intelligence division had managed to decode, had spent the last several years quietly building something. Not a war fleet in any sense we would have recognized as threatening, since none of our surveillance had flagged unusual military activity within their home systems. Instead, they had spent that time refining something closer to a legal framework, a systematic method for cataloging every act of mistreatment their citizens had experienced since first contact, cross-referencing it against the exact individuals responsible, and waiting for a moment when the pattern of neglect had grown undeniable enough to act on all at once. The 11 days at Junction 7, it seemed, had not been the cause of what was happening. It had been the final entry in a ledger that had simply grown too long to ignore. I found this explanation more unsettling than any theory involving sudden aggression or a hidden military buildup, because it meant the entire response we were witnessing had never been impulsive. It had been planned, calculated, and delayed deliberately, the way a careful person waits until they have gathered enough evidence before finally speaking. Over the following week, the pattern continued, exactly as Usep had described. Ships arrived, quietly located the individuals connected to specific decisions, and departed without incident once their search concluded. No station was destroyed. No population center was threatened. Civilian casualties, according to every report reaching Sector Command, remained at zero. This precision, more than anything else, was what began to shift the tone of the council sessions I attended during that period. The initial panic, born from imagining an indiscriminate assault, slowly gave way to something more complicated, a recognition that whatever this was, it operated according to rules, even if those rules were entirely unfamiliar to us. I remember a session where a senior counselor named Threb Ocelon, an elder of the Kethrani delegation known for his patience in even the most difficult negotiations, asked the question that seemed to hang over every discussion by that point. If this species is capable of such precision, why has it chosen this method at all? Why not send a formal grievance to the council instead of acting unilaterally? Nobody in that chamber could answer him, though I found myself thinking, in the quiet moments after the session ended, that perhaps the answer was simpler than any of us wanted to admit. Humanity had sent formal grievances before. I had personally reviewed several of them during my years processing incident reports. Every one of those grievances had been acknowledged, filed, and quietly set aside, the offending parties rarely facing any consequence beyond a written reprimand that carried no real weight. The system we had built to handle disputes between species had never been designed to hold established powers accountable to newer ones. It had been designed to manage the complaints of the young until they learned, as every species before them supposedly had, to accept the limits of their position. Humanity, it seemed, had studied that system carefully enough to understand it would never deliver the accountability they were owed, and had decided, quietly and without announcement, to build something else instead. I was asked to accompany a small delegation sent to observe one of the affected systems directly, a decision I still do not fully understand, since my role had never involved fieldwork of any kind. I suspect it was simply that nobody with more relevant experience wanted to volunteer, and my name was already associated with the initial incident report. Whatever the reason, I found myself aboard a transport heading toward a system called Halveth Cluster, where a Terran vessel had reportedly made contact 3 days earlier. The system itself was unremarkable, a mid-sized trading post orbiting a dim yellow star, populated mostly by Corvani merchants, and a rotating population of contracted labor from half a dozen other species. I had reviewed the incident connected to this location before departure. Years earlier, a human engineer working under a labor contract at the station had been injured during an equipment malfunction that internal records later confirmed had been caused by inadequate maintenance, a cost-saving decision made by the station's operations director at the time. The engineer had been quietly dismissed rather than compensated, the incident buried beneath layers of administrative language describing it as a voluntary departure due to personal circumstances. When our transport arrived, the Terran vessel was already docked, calm and still, exactly as every other report had described. I stood at the observation window of our own ship, watching through the docking bay's transparent partition as a single figure disembarked. I do not know why I expected something more imposing. Perhaps some part of me still clung to the idea that whatever force had been carrying out these actions must resemble the fear it inspired. Instead, I saw a woman, unremarkable in appearance, dressed in a simple gray uniform without insignia, walking with the calm, unhurried gait that had become the signature of every encounter so far. Her name, according to records our intelligence officers compiled afterward, was Grace Whitfield. I do not know her rank, or whether rank in the traditional sense meant anything to whatever organization she represented. What I do know is that she walked directly to the station's administrative offices, spoke briefly with the current operations director, a Corvani official who had inherited the position only 2 years earlier and had nothing to do with the original incident, and requested, calmly and specifically, the current location of the individual responsible for the maintenance decision that had injured the engineer. The current director, understandably confused and frightened, explained that the individual in question had since retired and relocated to a private residence in a neighboring system, well outside the trading post's jurisdiction. I watched, through a translated feed our delegation had been permitted limited access to, as Grace Whitfield simply nodded, thanked the director for the information, and returned to her vessel without another word. I remember feeling a strange combination of relief and dread as I watched her ship depart. Relief, because nothing violent had occurred in front of us. Dread, because I understood immediately that this was not the end of the matter. The individual responsible had simply moved further down whatever list Grace Whitfield was working through, and I had no doubt that list would eventually reach him, regardless of how far he had relocated. Our delegation returned to Outpost Rydellum with a report that, for the first time since this entire situation began, offered something resembling useful information rather than simple documentation of fear. Humanity's response, whatever its ultimate scope, was operating according to a clear and consistent methodology. Identify the individual responsible for a specific act of harm against a Terran citizen. Locate that individual, regardless of how much time had passed or how far they had moved. Confront them directly, without violence toward anyone else present, and address the matter according to a standard we still did not fully understand, since in every documented case so far, the confrontation itself had ended the encounter without any visible escalation. This raised a question that consumed nearly every private conversation I had during that period. What exactly happened to the individuals who were confronted? No station had reported deaths connected to these encounters. No arrests had been made in any traditional sense. The individuals in question simply vanished from public records shortly after their confrontation, their fates unknown to anyone outside whatever process humanity had established. I raised this question directly during my next council testimony, and for the first time since the crisis began, I saw genuine fear cross the faces of several senior counselors who had, until that point, maintained a careful diplomatic composure. Threbasalan asked me directly whether I believed these individuals were being harmed, and I told him honestly that I did not know, though the absence of any confirmed harm across dozens of documented encounters suggested something more complicated than simple retribution. It was during this same session that a junior researcher from the Concord's intelligence division, a Vantic analyst named Oskiel Thurn, presented findings that shifted the entire tone of the discussion. His team had managed to intercept and partially decode a transmission originating from human space, not intended for our systems at all, but for internal use among what appeared to be human enforcement personnel. The transmission described, in clinical detail, a process by which individuals identified through what the humans referred to as their accountability registry were located, formally notified of the specific grievance connected to their actions, and given the opportunity to provide restitution directly to the harmed party or their surviving family before any further action was taken. I remember the room falling completely silent as Oskiel finished reading the translated fragment aloud. What we had assumed, for weeks, was some form of unexplained punishment, turned out to be something closer to a system of enforced restitution, conducted privately and without the theater of public trial, but governed by rules that appeared, at least on the surface, to be far more consistent than anything our own council had ever managed to enforce against established powers who mistreated newer species. This revelation did not calm the chamber. If anything, it deepened the unease, because it meant humanity was not acting out of chaos or unrestrained anger. They were acting according to a deliberate, internally consistent system of justice, one they had apparently built quietly over years, waiting for the moment when patience no longer served their interests. I left that session with a question I could not shake, one that would follow me through every remaining day of this crisis. If humanity had built such a system in secret, refining it carefully enough to apply it with this level of precision across dozens of systems simultaneously, what exactly had convinced them, after decades of quiet endurance, that the time had finally come to use it? I did not yet know the answer, though I suspected, even then, that the answer would be found not in any single dramatic event, but in the slow accumulation of everything we had allowed ourselves to do to them, while assuming they would never be in a position to respond. To understand why humanity built such a system at all, I had to go back further than the crisis itself, back to the earliest days of contact, before any of us understood what kind of species we were dealing with. I spent the following weeks, while the council debated its response, reviewing the original contact archives, hoping to find some explanation for how patience this deep had been allowed to build without a single warning sign our diplomats had thought worth escalating. The first recorded contact with Earth had occurred a little over 3 decades before the events at Junction 7, when a Severnax survey vessel monitoring deep space signals detected a cluster of radio transmissions originating from a system nobody had bothered to catalog in detail before. I remember reading the initial survey report as part of my training years ago, and even then, something about the tone of it had stayed with me, though I had never thought to question it until now. The report described Earth's inhabitants as technologically primitive but culturally complex, a species showing early signs of unification under a single planetary government, though still centuries behind the established powers of the galaxy in nearly every measurable category. That single word, primitive, appeared in almost every subsequent document related to humanity for the next several years, and I do not think anyone who used it intended real malice. It was simply the language we used for every newly discovered species, a shorthand that carried with it an entire set of assumptions about how such a species should be treated. Primitive species, according to the unwritten conventions that governed our diplomacy, were to be guided rather than consulted, corrected rather than heard, and granted access to galactic society only gradually, as a kind of privilege extended by those who had arrived first. Humanity's initial response to contact had been, by every account I reviewed, remarkably open. Within a year of formal introduction to the wider galactic community, human representatives had requested membership discussions with nearly every major trade organization and diplomatic body they could identify, eager to participate fully in a community they seemed to view as an extraordinary opportunity rather than a threat. I found this eagerness documented extensively in early transcripts, human delegates asking detailed questions about trade regulations, diplomatic protocols, and shared technological standards, clearly hoping to integrate quickly and fully. The response from established powers, my own included, had been considerably less generous. I found a transcript from an early trade negotiation, held only 4 years after first contact, in which a Severnax representative had explained to a human delegate that full trade privileges would require a probationary period of no less than 2 decades, during which human vessels would be subject to inspection standards not applied to established member species. The human delegate, according to the transcript, had asked several clarifying questions about the reasoning behind this policy, questions that were answered with vague references to established precedent rather than any specific justification. The delegate had accepted the terms without further protest, a response that, at the time, was noted approvingly in the Concord's internal assessment as evidence of humanity's cooperative and non-confrontational temperament. I began to notice a pattern as I moved through years of archived documents, one that made my chest tighten with a discomfort I had not expected to feel while doing routine research. Every disadvantageous term humanity accepted, Every dismissed grievance, every quietly absorbed insult, had been logged in our own records as evidence of good behavior. We had, without ever intending to create such a system, built an entire framework that rewarded humanity's patience by extracting more from it, treating every act of restraint as an invitation to ask for a little more restraint the next time. I found an incident from 8 years after first contact that struck me with particular force, perhaps because it so closely mirrored what would eventually happen at Junction 7. A Terran research vessel conducting an approved survey near a Concord-administered system had been detained for what was later determined to be an unnecessary security check, one that lasted 9 days and resulted in the loss of an entire season's worth of collected data due to power restrictions imposed on the vessel during its detention. The formal complaint filed by the Terran government afterward had been thorough, detailed, and entirely reasonable in its requests, asking only for compensation for the lost research time and a review of the inspection policy that had caused the delay. The response, which I found preserved in full within the archive, offered a formal apology alongside a token compensation payment that amounted to less than 1/10 of the estimated value of the lost research. No review of the inspection policy was ever conducted. The matter was closed within the Concord's internal system, with a note describing it as satisfactorily resolved. I remember sitting with that document for a long time, trying to understand how many similar entries existed across 3 decades of contact, and whether anyone within our own government had ever paused to consider what might happen if a species with the capacity for careful, patient record-keeping decided, one day, that satisfactorily resolved was not the same as actually resolved. What troubled me most, as I continued my research, was discovering that humanity had never stopped trying to engage through official channels, even as the terms offered to them grew more unfavorable rather than less. I found records of human representatives requesting reviews of trade agreements, as recently as 3 years before the Junction 7 incident. Each request met with the same polite deferral, the same promise of future consideration that never quite arrived. There had been no single moment of humanity abandoning diplomacy. There had only been a slow, quiet accumulation of evidence that diplomacy, as we practiced it, was never going to deliver what they were owed. I also found something I had not expected, buried within an internal assessment written by a senior Kethrani official nearly 15 years earlier, long before I had joined the diplomatic corps myself. The official, whose name I will not include here out of a strange, lingering sense of professional courtesy, had written a memo cautioning against what he described as the Concord's habit of treating Terran patients as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. He warned, with a clarity that struck me as almost prophetic given everything that followed, that a species capable of rapid technological advancement and demonstrated organizational discipline should not be assumed to remain indefinitely tolerant of unequal treatment, and that continued exploitation of their cooperative temperament carried long-term risks that far outweighed the short-term benefits being extracted. That memo, according to the records available to me, had been read, filed, and never acted upon. I do not know what happened to the official who wrote it, though I found myself hoping, in a way that surprised me, that he had lived long enough to see whether his warning had been justified. I brought these findings to my next council session, presenting them not as an excuse for humanity's current actions, but as context that I believed the council desperately needed if it hoped to respond wisely rather than reactively. I remember the room's reaction was more complicated than I expected. Some councilors, particularly among the older delegations, seemed genuinely troubled by what I had uncovered, recognizing in my research a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond humanity to nearly every young species the Concord had ever integrated. Others, however, responded with a defensiveness that unsettled me more than any hostility could have, insisting that established protocols existed for good reason, and that whatever grievances humanity held, unilateral action of this scale could never be justified regardless of the provocation. I remember Threb Ocelon, the elder Kethrani counselor whose questions had shaped so much of the discussion up to that point, asking me directly whether I believed humanity's response was justified. I told him, as honestly as I could manage, that I did not know whether justified was the right word, but that I had found nothing in 3 decades of documentation suggesting humanity had been given any meaningful alternative. Every formal channel available to them had absorbed their grievances without delivering accountability. If accountability was something they had eventually decided to enforce themselves, I told the chamber, it was difficult to argue they had not exhausted every other option first. The session ended without resolution, as most sessions had during this period, though I noticed something shifting in the tone of the discussions that followed over the next several days. Fewer counselors spoke about humanity's actions purely in terms of aggression. More conversations, held quietly in corridors and private offices, began to focus instead on a question that I suspect had been avoided deliberately until now. If humanity's patience had run out after 3 decades of accumulated mistreatment, how many other species within the Concord sphere of influence might be keeping similar records of their own, waiting for a moment when their own patience finally reached its limit as well? I did not have an answer to that question, and I do not think anyone in that chamber did either. What I did understand, more clearly with each passing day, was that the crisis we were facing had never truly been about a single species arriving with unprecedented power. It was about the slow, quiet failure of a system that had convinced itself, for far too long, that patience could be extracted indefinitely from anyone willing to offer it, without ever considering what might happen the day that offer was finally withdrawn. Whatever comfort the Council found in framing humanity's actions as measured and restrained did not last long, because the situation shifted dramatically less than 2 weeks after my research findings were presented. I was summoned back to Outpost Rydellum in the middle of what should have been a rest cycle, pulled from my quarters by an urgent message from USEP that contained only a single line: "The pattern has changed. Come immediately." I arrived to find the observation deck in a state I had not seen before. Not the tense but controlled atmosphere of earlier weeks, but something closer to genuine alarm. USEP met me at the entrance, and for the first time since this entire crisis began, I saw something in his expression that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "The border fleet stationed near Junction 7 is gone," he said, without any preamble. "Not damaged, not scattered. Gone, in the span of under 4 minutes. I asked him to explain, and he pulled up the recorded sensor data from the encounter. The first time in this entire crisis that a Terran vessel had engaged a military force directly, rather than simply locating individuals for confrontation. The border fleet in question consisted of 12 Concord cruisers, stationed there specifically in response to the original crisis, tasked with monitoring further Terran activity in the sector. According to the sensor logs, a single Terran vessel had entered the system, broadcast no hailing signal at all this time, and proceeded to disable every cruiser in the fleet with a level of precision that our own tactical analysts, reviewing the footage afterward, described as almost surgical. I watched the recording myself, played back at reduced speed so the analysts could study each individual engagement. What struck me immediately was the absence of any wasted action. Each Concord cruiser was targeted in sequence, disabled through what appeared to be precisely calibrated strikes against propulsion and weapons systems, rather than life support or crew compartments. Not a single cruiser was destroyed outright. Every vessel remained intact, drifting and powerless, but the crews aboard them, according to distress signals received afterward, were alive and largely uninjured. I asked USEP why, if this engagement had been so restrained in terms of casualties, it had left him and everyone else on this deck looking as shaken as they did. He turned to me with an expression I will not forget, and explained that the analysts had identified something in the targeting pattern that none of them had initially wanted to believe. Every officer who had been disabled and captured from those 12 cruisers was cross-referenced, within hours, against the same accountability registry that had governed every previous encounter in this crisis. The fleet had not been attacked indiscriminately. It had been specifically dismantled to allow for the extraction of particular individuals, officers whose service records connected them directly to command decisions made during the original detention at Junction 7, or to subsequent enforcement actions taken against Terran citizens in the following months. The ship had known, with perfect accuracy, exactly which officers among those 12 crews were responsible for what, despite the fact that this information was buried within internal Concord personnel files that had never been shared with any outside party, let alone a species we had spent decades treating as a probationary member of galactic society. I remember asking the obvious question, the one that had been building in me since the very first encounter at our border. How? How could a species we had catalogued as technologically behind our own possibly access records, this sensitive, this deeply embedded within systems we considered secure? Oskiel Thurn, the intelligence analyst whose earlier findings had shifted the tone of council discussions, was brought in to address this exact question during an emergency session convened only hours later. His answer, delivered with the careful precision of someone who had clearly spent considerable time confirming his conclusions before presenting them, explained that humanity had not, in fact, breached any Concord security system directly. Instead, they had spent years cultivating something far simpler and, in retrospect, far more effective: relationships. Humanity, according to Oskiel's findings, had spent much of the past decade building quiet trade partnerships and technical collaborations with dozens of smaller species and independent contractors throughout Concord territory, many of them the same overlooked populations who handled logistics, maintenance, and administrative processing for larger powers like our own. These smaller partners, treated with the same casual disregard by established powers as humanity itself had experienced, had apparently found in humanity something unusual: a trading partner who negotiated fairly, honored agreements consistently, and treated even minor collaborators with a level of respect that many of them had rarely received from anyone else in galactic society. Over years of these quiet, unremarkable partnerships, information had flowed steadily toward Earth, not through espionage or theft, but through simple goodwill, extended by populations who had their own reasons to feel underappreciated by the same hierarchy that had mistreated humanity. Personnel records, incident reports, internal communications, all of it had passed through the hands of contractors and administrators who saw nothing wrong with sharing information with a partner who had never given them reason to distrust them, and who had, in many cases, treated them better than their own supposed allies within the Concord ever had. I sat in that emergency session absorbing the implications of what Oskiel was describing, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as a dawning recognition of just how thoroughly we had underestimated this species. Humanity had not built a weapon capable of overwhelming us through raw power alone. They had built a network, patiently, over years, using nothing more dramatic than fair treatment and consistent respect toward populations the rest of us had simply stopped noticing. The council session that followed this revelation was unlike any I had attended before. The defensive tone that had characterized earlier discussions was almost entirely absent, replaced by a kind of stunned recalculation, as delegation after delegation began quietly reviewing their own treatment of smaller species and contractors within their own territories, clearly wondering how much of their own internal information might already be sitting somewhere within Terran archives, waiting to be used in exactly the same methodical fashion. Threb Ocelon asked Oskiel directly whether this meant every species within Concord territory should now consider its internal records compromised, and Oskiel's answer, delivered without any attempt to soften it, was that any species whose treatment of smaller partners mirrored the pattern we had shown toward humanity should assume exactly that. I remember the silence that followed this statement, lasting longer than any silence I had witnessed in that chamber before, and I understood, watching the faces around me, that something fundamental had shifted in how the council understood the crisis it was facing. This was no longer a matter of managing a single species' grievances. It was a recognition that the entire structure of casual disregard we had built our diplomacy upon had left every established power vulnerable in ways none of us had ever considered, because we had never thought to consider the people we overlooked as capable of remembering, let alone acting. The captured officers from the disabled border fleet were, according to reports that reached us over the following days, treated according to the same restitution process Oskiel had described weeks earlier. Formal notification of the specific grievance connected to their actions, an opportunity to provide restitution directly, and a resolution that, once again, left no confirmed casualties in its wake, though the officers themselves were reportedly held for an extended period before eventual release. Their service records marked in a way that several Concord military analysts noted would likely end their careers entirely. I found myself thinking, during this period, about a distinction that had not fully occurred to me until I watched this pattern repeat itself across dozens of encounters. Humanity's response, however severe its consequences for the individuals involved, had consistently avoided the kind of indiscriminate harm that would have made them indistinguishable from any aggressor acting purely out of anger. Every action taken, from the very first encounter at our border to the dismantling of an entire fleet, had been aimed with precision at those directly responsible, while sparing everyone else caught in proximity to those decisions. This was not, I began to realize, the behavior of a species lashing out after years of suppressed frustration. It was the behavior of a species executing a plan they had refined carefully, waiting until they possessed both the information and the capability to carry it out exactly as intended. I raised this distinction during my next testimony, suggesting to the Council that understanding humanity's methodology mattered as much as understanding their grievances, because it offered the only reliable indication of what might happen next. If their actions continued to follow this pattern of precise, individually targeted accountability, rather than broad retaliation against Concord territory as a whole, then the crisis, however unsettling, remained one with defined boundaries. If that pattern ever shifted, however, towards something less restrained, I warned the Chamber that we would have no framework at all for predicting what might follow, because everything we thought we understood about this species had already proven wrong once. Threb Ocelon asked me, near the end of that session, whether I believed the pattern would hold. I told him honestly that I did not know, though I suspected the answer depended entirely on how the Council chose to respond in the days ahead. If we continued treating this crisis purely as a threat to be contained through force, I warned him, we risked provoking exactly the kind of escalation that had, until now, remained absent from every encounter we had documented. If, instead, we found a way to engage honestly with what humanity was actually asking for, accountability rather than domination, restitution rather than conquest, there remained a possibility, however narrow, that this crisis could still be resolved, without the wider devastation many in that chamber had begun to fear. I left that session uncertain whether anyone had truly listened, though I would soon discover that the Council's response, whatever form it eventually took, would be shaped less by my testimony than by a single voice that had, until this point, remained conspicuously absent from every discussion held so far. The voice of humanity itself, finally prepared to speak not through actions alone, but through words the entire galaxy would be forced to hear. The request for a formal council session, the first of its kind since the crisis began, arrived through official diplomatic channels 3 days after the border fleet encounter, and I remember the confusion it caused among the staff who received it, because it did not come from any Concord member requesting emergency deliberation. It came from Earth itself, a formal petition asking for time before the full assembled council, submitted through proper procedural channels, with a level of correctness that felt almost deliberately pointed, given everything that had happened in the weeks before. I was assigned, along with a handful of other liaison officers who had been involved in documenting the crisis, to help prepare the chamber for what promised to be the most heavily attended session in recent memory. Every major delegation within Concord territory had confirmed attendance, a fact that itself signaled how thoroughly this crisis had captured the attention of the entire galactic community. I remember standing at the edge of the main assembly floor the morning of the session, watching delegates from dozens of species file into their designated seats, and feeling a nervous energy in the room, unlike anything I had experienced in my years of service. Threb Ocelon found me shortly before the session began, and I remember the brief conversation we shared, because it captured something of the uncertainty everyone in that chamber carried with them that day. He asked me what I expected from the Terran delegation, and I admitted honestly that I did not know, since every previous interaction with humanity throughout this crisis had come not through words, but through action. Whatever they intended to say today, I told him, would be the first time in this entire crisis that we would hear their reasoning directly, rather than reconstructing it from incident reports and intercepted transmissions. The Terran delegation arrived precisely at the scheduled hour, a detail that several delegates around me noted quietly, since punctuality of that precision was unusual, even among established powers, let alone a species we had spent decades assuming operated according to less disciplined standards. The delegation itself consisted of only 3 individuals, a detail that struck me immediately, given the scale of the crisis under discussion. I had expected, perhaps unreasonably, a larger contingent, some show of force, or numbers, to match the gravity of what had unfolded across our territory in recent weeks. Instead, 3 people walked calmly to the podium, reserved for petitioning members, led by a man, whose name I would come to know well over the following hours. Nathaniel Price, formally introduced as Earth's senior ambassador to galactic affairs. He was flanked by two aides, a younger man named Peter Lang and a woman named Charlotte Wren, neither of whom spoke during the session that followed, though I noted their presence carried the same quiet, unhurried confidence that had characterized every Terran encounter throughout this crisis. Nathaniel Price did not raise his voice when he began speaking, and I remember being struck immediately by how deliberately calm his tone remained throughout the entire address, even as the content of what he said grew steadily more difficult for the chamber to absorb. He began not with demands or accusations, but with what he described as a simple accounting, a term he used repeatedly throughout his address, as though he wished to frame everything that followed not as grievance, but as arithmetic. He spoke first about Junction 7, though not in the way I expected. He did not dwell on the deaths of the 3 crew members, which had already been extensively documented. Instead, he described in careful and measured detail the 11 days of administrative delay that preceded those deaths, reading directly from what he identified as the original internal correspondence between Concord officials during that period. Correspondence that had clearly been obtained through the same quiet network Oskiel had described weeks earlier. He read the exact language used by officials who had debated jurisdiction, while 3 people slowly ran out of the resources needed to survive, and I watched several delegates in the chamber visibly flinch as the precise wording of those internal messages was read aloud in a room full of representatives from every major power in the galaxy. He did not stop with Junction 7. Over the following hour, Nathaniel Price methodically worked through case after case, each one drawn from the same accountability registry that had governed every encounter throughout this crisis. Though hearing them recited aloud in sequence, rather than scattered across weeks of incident reports, produced an effect on the chamber I do not think anyone had anticipated. The trade agreement forced upon Terran merchants years earlier, underpaying them for critical mineral shipments. The dismissal of a diplomatic aide from a negotiation session for no reason beyond a senior official's discomfort with her presence. The engineer injured through inadequate maintenance at Halveth Cluster, quietly dismissed rather than compensated. Case after case, each one small enough on its own to be dismissed, but accumulating, sentence by sentence, into something the entire chamber could no longer look away from. I watched Threb Ocelon throughout this recitation, and I noticed his expression shift from careful diplomatic neutrality into something closer to genuine discomfort, as the list continued, case after case, each one connected not to some abstract grievance, but to specific individuals, specific decisions, specific moments where someone within our own systems had chosen convenience or prejudice over basic fairness, and had faced no consequence for that choice until now. When Nathaniel Price finally paused, having worked through what he described as only a representative sample of a far larger record, he set down the documents he had been reading from and addressed the chamber directly, without notes, in a tone that had not changed once throughout the entire address. He explained, in language I remember almost precisely because of how carefully it had been chosen, that humanity had never sought conflict with the Concord or any of its member species. Every grievance he had just described, he reminded the chamber, had first been raised through proper diplomatic channels, filed according to established procedure, and resolved, in every single instance, in a manner that favored convenience for the offending party over genuine accountability. He explained that humanity had continued pursuing these formal channels for nearly 3 decades, not out of naivety, but out of a genuine belief that patience and good faith would eventually be rewarded with fair treatment. He then said something that I have thought about many times since, because it reframed everything that had happened over the preceding weeks in a way the chamber had not fully considered before. He explained that what the galaxy had witnessed was never intended as an act of war. It was, he said, the simple and inevitable consequence of what happens when a functioning system of accountability is denied to a people for long enough that they are forced to build their own. He described this not as vengeance, a word he explicitly rejected during his address, but as policy, a deliberate and carefully calibrated response designed specifically to address the individuals responsible for specific harms, while leaving the broader structure of galactic society intact, at least for now. A delegate from the Vantic Assembly, one of the more hardline voices that had emerged over the preceding weeks, rose to challenge him directly, demanding to know by what authority humanity believed it could act unilaterally against Concord personnel and military assets, without any formal declaration or council approval. I remember the chamber holding its breath as Nathaniel Price responded, his tone still calm, though something in his phrasing carried an edge I had not heard from him before. He asked the delegate, in turn, by what authority the Concord had denied humanity meaningful recourse for 3 decades of documented mistreatment, while insisting that same species continue operating exclusively within a system that had never once delivered genuine accountability in return. He reminded the chamber that every formal request for review, every grievance filed, every attempt at negotiation had been met with the same pattern of polite deferral, and that humanity had exhausted every available channel long before choosing to act outside them. The Vantic delegate had no response prepared for this, and I watched him sit down slowly, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. It was at this point that Nathaniel Price introduced the doctrine that would come to define humanity's position for the remainder of the crisis, a framework he described simply as proportional and inevitable consequence. He explained that humanity had no interest in expanding this response beyond those directly responsible for specific harms, and reaffirmed that every action taken throughout the crisis had been deliberately calibrated to avoid escalation beyond what was necessary to address each individual case. He stated plainly that this restraint was not born from any limitation in capability, a statement that carried an unmistakable weight given the demonstrated ability to dismantle an entire border fleet in under 4 minutes, but from a genuine desire to resolve this matter without further conflict, provided the Concord was finally willing to acknowledge the pattern of behavior that had made this response necessary in the first place. He closed his address with a request rather than a demand, asking the Council to formally review its treatment of newer and smaller member species, to establish genuine mechanisms of accountability, rather than the polite deferrals that had characterized galactic diplomacy for as long as anyone in that chamber could remember, and to recognize, before any further crisis of this scale became necessary, that patience extended by any people, however young or technologically behind the established powers of the galaxy, was never a resource that could be extracted indefinitely without consequence. When he finished speaking, the chamber remained silent for what felt like an unusually long stretch of time, longer even than the silence that had followed Oskeel's revelations weeks earlier. I looked around at the assembled delegates, watching expressions I had never seen on so many faces at once, a mixture of shame, uncertainty, and something that I think, for many of them, resembled genuine fear, not of humanity's capability alone, but of the recognition that the system they had all built their careers within had failed exactly the people it claimed to protect, quietly and consistently, for decades. Threb Ocelon was the first to speak, rising slowly from his seat, and I remember the question he asked, because it was the first genuinely honest question I had heard from the council floor since this entire crisis began. He asked Nathaniel Price directly what would need to happen for humanity to consider this matter resolved. Nathaniel Price's answer was simple, delivered without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for someone to finally ask it. Accountability, he said, applied consistently, to everyone, regardless of how long they had belonged to this community, or how much power they held within it. Nothing more, he added, and nothing less. I left that session understanding, for the first time since watching that single ship arrive at our border weeks earlier, that whatever came next would depend entirely on whether the Concord was finally willing to become the kind of institution it had always claimed to be, rather than the one it had actually built through years of quiet, careless neglect. The days following Nathaniel Price's address were unlike anything I had experienced in my years within the diplomatic corps, because for the first time since I had joined this profession, I watched an entire institution scramble to re-examine itself, rather than simply manage the appearance of a crisis until it faded from attention. The Council convened 3 additional sessions within the following week, an unprecedented pace by any standard I was familiar with, and I found myself called upon repeatedly, not merely to testify about what I had witnessed, but to help draft language for what was beginning to take shape as a genuine reform of how the Concord handled disputes between established and newer member species. I want to describe what this process actually looked like, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this account. It was not clean. It was not immediate. Several delegations, particularly among the oldest and most powerful members of the Concord, resisted the proposed reforms with an intensity that surprised even me, arguing that the precedent of allowing a single crisis to dictate sweeping institutional change would invite further unilateral action from any species dissatisfied with existing arrangements. I remember sitting through one particularly heated session where a senior Severnax delegate, a woman whose family had served on the council for 3 generations, argued that capitulating to what she called coercive pressure from Earth would signal weakness to every other species watching, potentially inviting further disruption from populations who might now believe force was the only reliable path to fair treatment. Threb Ocelon, who had emerged over the preceding weeks as one of the more thoughtful voices on the council floor, responded to her directly in a moment I still think about often. He asked her whether she believed the current system, the one that had driven a patient species to build an entirely independent framework of accountability rather than trust the institutions meant to provide it, could genuinely be called anything other than already broken. He reminded the chamber that humanity had not been the first species to raise concerns about unequal treatment within the Concord, only the first with the capability and, eventually, the willingness to act on those concerns directly. If reform was delayed further, he warned, the Council should not be surprised to find itself facing a similar crisis from another quarter, quite possibly one lacking the restraint humanity had shown throughout this entire ordeal. I do not know whether his argument alone shifted the balance of opinion within that chamber, but something did, because by the end of that week, a formal proposal had been drafted, establishing what would eventually become known as the Universal Standards of Accountability, a framework requiring every member species, regardless of seniority or historical standing, to submit to independent review whenever formal grievances were filed by another member, with binding consequences attached to confirmed violations, rather than the token compensation and quiet dismissal that had characterized the previous system. I was present when this proposal was brought before the full council for a final vote, and I remember the atmosphere in that chamber feeling entirely different from any session I had attended during the earlier weeks of this crisis. The fear that had characterized those earlier discussions had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else, a kind of cautious recognition that the alternative to reform was not stability, but simply waiting for the next species to reach the same limit humanity had already reached, with no guarantee that the next response would be as restrained as this one had been. The vote passed, though not unanimously, with several delegations abstaining, rather than voting against a measure that had become politically impossible to openly oppose, given the scrutiny the entire crisis had brought upon the Council's internal practices. I remember feeling, in that moment, a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, because I understood that a vote on paper was only the first step in a much longer process of actually changing how established powers treated the species they had spent decades quietly exploiting. Word of the Council's decision reached Earth within hours, relayed through the same formal channels that had carried Nathaniel Price's original petition weeks earlier. I do not know what conversations took place within human government circles in response to this news, since our access to internal Terran communications had always been limited to what their own network of partners chose to share with us, and this particular decision, it seemed, was not something they intended to broadcast widely. What I do know is that the pattern of incidents that had defined this crisis for the preceding weeks began, almost immediately, to slow. USEP informed me, during a call I received nearly 2 weeks after the Council's vote, that no new encounters matching the earlier pattern had been reported anywhere within Concord territory during that period. The remaining individuals still listed within the accountability registry, according to intelligence estimates Oskiel's team had compiled, numbered in the low dozens, a fraction of what the original list had apparently contained before this crisis began. Whether humanity intended to continue pursuing those remaining cases, or whether the Council's reforms had satisfied whatever standard they had been waiting for, remained unclear to everyone I spoke with during that period. I found myself invited, somewhat unexpectedly, to a smaller and far less formal meeting, held several weeks after the Council's vote, a gathering arranged quietly between a handful of liaison officers, including myself, and a delegation from Earth that included both Nathaniel Price and Grace Whitfield, the same woman I had watched confront the operations director at Halveth Cluster months earlier. I do not know why I was included among the officers invited, though I suspect my earlier research into the history of Terran mistreatment had been noted by someone within the Concord's administration, marking me as someone who had at least attempted to understand this crisis honestly, rather than simply managing its optics. The meeting itself was unremarkable in its setting, held in a modest conference room rather than any grand chamber, but I remember the conversation that took place there more clearly than almost anything else from this entire period. Nathaniel Price spoke candidly, in a way he had not during his formal address to the Council, about the years of internal debate that had preceded humanity's decision to act. He described, without any of the careful diplomatic phrasing he had used before the full assembly, a government deeply divided over whether unilateral action of this scale was wise, whether it risked provoking a response from the Concord that could far outweigh whatever accountability they hoped to achieve. He told us that the final decision had not come from any single dramatic event, but from a recognition, shared gradually across enough of Earth's leadership, that continuing to endure quiet mistreatment indefinitely, in the hope that patience would eventually be rewarded, was itself a kind of failure, one that risked teaching an entire generation of young humans that fairness was something to be earned through submission, rather than something owed by default to any people willing to act in good faith. Grace Whitfield, quieter throughout most of the meeting, added something near its conclusion that I have carried with me since. She said that the hardest part of her work throughout this crisis had never been locating the individuals on the registry, a task that, given the network humanity had spent years cultivating, had rarely proven difficult. The hardest part, she explained, had been the restraint required to address only those directly responsible, to resist the temptation, present in every single encounter, to hold accountable an entire system that had allowed such quiet cruelty to persist for so long, rather than the specific individuals who had carried it out. I asked her, near the end of that meeting, whether she believed the reforms passed by the Council would be enough to prevent a crisis like this from happening again, either with humanity or with any other species facing similar treatment in the future. She considered the question carefully before answering, and her response was one I found both reassuring and quietly unsettling in equal measure. She said that reforms passed under pressure had a tendency to erode once the pressure that produced them faded, and that the true test of whether anything had genuinely changed would not be found in any document the Council had signed, but in how established powers treated their newest and smallest members 5, 10, 20 years from now, once the memory of this crisis had softened into something easier to set aside. I left that meeting with a question I have not fully answered even now, as I compile this account for whatever record future officials might need to understand what happened during these months. Had we, as an institution, genuinely learned something from what humanity had shown us, or had we simply been frightened into a temporary correction, one that would quietly unravel the moment a new generation of officials arrived who had not personally witnessed the consequences of our previous negligence? I do not know the answer to that question yet, and I suspect I will not know it for many years. What I do know, with a certainty I did not possess before this crisis began, is that the galaxy I once believed I understood, a place governed by predictable hierarchies and the quiet assumption that seniority alone earned deference, had never truly existed in the way I imagined. It had always been built on the patience of those willing to extend it, and that patience, however deep, was never a resource that could be drawn from indefinitely without consequence. Nearly a year has passed since Nathaniel Price stood before the full council and delivered an accounting the entire galaxy was forced to hear, and I find myself, in preparing this final part of my record, less certain of easy conclusions than I expected to be when this crisis first began. I had hoped, somewhere in the process of documenting everything I witnessed, that I would arrive at a clear resolution, a sense that the danger had passed and the lessons had been learned thoroughly enough to prevent anything like this from happening again. What I have found instead is something more complicated, and I think more honest. The reforms passed in the wake of the crisis have, by most measures I can access, held firmer than Grace Whitfield's cautious prediction suggested they might. Independent review boards, staffed with representatives drawn from smaller and newer member species rather than exclusively from established powers, now process grievances that would once have disappeared quietly into administrative filing systems. I have personally reviewed several cases handled under this new framework, disputes involving trade imbalances, and labor conditions affecting populations who, only a year earlier, would have had no meaningful recourse at all. The outcomes have not always favored the complaining party, and I think that matters as much as the cases that have. A system capable of ruling against the vulnerable as readily as it rules against the powerful is, I have come to believe, the only kind of system that can honestly claim to be fair. I have also watched, with an unease I have not entirely shaken, several established delegations begin to quietly test the boundaries of these new standards, probing for the same gaps and delays that once allowed grievances to be managed rather than resolved. Threb Osalan, who has continued serving as one of the Council's more persistent advocates for genuine accountability, mentioned to me recently that he suspects the coming years will determine far more about the durability of these reforms than the initial crisis itself did. A crisis, he reminded me, forces attention. It is the slow, unremarkable years afterward, when the memory of consequence begins to fade, that reveal whether an institution has genuinely changed or merely learned to perform change convincingly enough to avoid another confrontation. I think often about the smaller species and independent contractors whose quiet goodwill toward humanity ultimately made this entire crisis possible. Populations that established powers like my own had spent decades overlooking entirely, treating their cooperation as a given rather than something earned through fair dealing. I have made a point, in the time since this crisis concluded, of reviewing how the Concord's larger delegations currently treat these same populations, and I have found, encouragingly, a marked shift in tone across several sectors. Administrators and officials suddenly far more attentive to complaints they might once have dismissed without a second thought. Whether this attentiveness stems from genuine reflection or simple fear of what might happen if these populations ever again found reason to extend their trust elsewhere, I cannot say with certainty, though I have come to believe that the distinction may matter less than the outcome itself, at least in these early years of adjustment. I have not had direct contact with Nathaniel Price or Grace Whitfield since that quiet meeting in the modest conference room, though I understand both remain active in Earth's ongoing diplomatic engagement with the wider galactic community, engagement that has, notably, continued in good faith despite everything that preceded it. Earth did not withdraw from galactic society following this crisis, nor did it use its demonstrated capability to pursue any advantage beyond the accountability it had explicitly sought. I find this restraint, sustained now over the better part of a year, more remarkable in some ways than the precision of their original response, since it would have been simple, given the fear their capabilities had instilled across every established power in this region, to leverage that fear into concessions far beyond fair treatment. They did not, and I think that restraint, more than any single encounter during the crisis itself, is what ultimately convinced the Council that genuine reform was necessary rather than merely convenient. A species seeking domination gives you no reason to change, only reason to arm yourself against them. A species seeking only fairness, demonstrated through consistent restraint even after proving its capability for far more, leaves an institution with no honest justification for refusing to become better than it was. I think back often to that morning on the observation deck at Outpost Rydellum, watching a single unmarked vessel drift toward our border, with a patience that felt, at the time, more unsettling than any show of force could have. I understand now, with the clarity that only distance and reflection can provide, that the true nightmare the galaxy faced was never humanity itself. It was the slow, comfortable complacency an entire community of powerful species had built for itself over generations, a complacency that assumed patience extended by the young and the small was a permanent condition rather than a temporary courtesy, one that could be withdrawn the moment it stopped being honored. Humanity did not arrive to conquer us. They arrived to prove, through methods precise enough to leave no room for denial, that the system we had built to manage the galaxy's newest members had never truly served the purpose it claimed. They arrived carrying decades of quiet documentation, patient enough to wait until the pattern of our neglect had become undeniable, and disciplined enough, even in the moment of their response, to hold that response to exactly the scope their grievances justified, nothing more. I do not know whether every lesson from this crisis will hold as the years pass, and the memory of a single warship arriving without warning begins to soften into something easier to set aside. I know only that I, and I suspect many others who witnessed this crisis directly, will not soon forget the particular quality of that silence on the hailing channel, the calm and unhurried voice that told us plainly this was not a negotiation, and the slow, dawning understanding that followed, that we had spent 30 years mistaking someone else's patience for the absence of a limit, rather than recognizing it, far too late, as a courtesy we had simply never earned. The true nightmare, I have come to believe, was never a single ship arriving at our border. It was the galaxy's own complacency, comfortable and unexamined for generations, finally forced to look at itself clearly in the reflection of a patience it had exhausted without ever noticing the cost. And if there is a lesson worth carrying forward from everything I have recorded here, it is simply this: no people, however young, however new to the wider community they hope to join, should ever be measured by how quietly they endure unfair treatment. The measure that matters, the one this crisis finally forced an entire galaxy to confront, is how a community treats those it believes will never be in a position to answer back. Humanity answered, and the galaxy, for the first time in longer than anyone in that council chamber cared to admit, was finally listening.